I sold my tech empire for $50 million and took my son to a fine restaurant to celebrate. While my son raised his glass and smiled at my success, a waiter leaned in and whispered words that stopped my heart cold. "I saw your son put something in your wine." I didn't scream. I didn't call the police. I didn't even look at him. I quietly stood up, walked out into the freezing night air, and began executing a plan they would never expect. One small thing before we go any further. I truly appreciate you taking the time to listen to my journey today. If you're still here, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. Your presence here truly matters. Also, please note, this story includes some fictional elements added for entertainment and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real names or settings is purely coincidental, but the message I'm conveying to you is truly valuable and worth remembering. The vintage Cabernet hit the back of my throat like liquid gold, but the man standing behind me was already counting the seconds until my heart stopped. I am Lance Griffin, a 68-year-old retired software architect, with eyes as sharp as a compiled line of code and a watch that Maria bought me for my first million. Tonight, at the head of this table at the terrace, I was supposed to be the master of the universe. The celebration wasn't just a dinner. It was a meticulously set trap where the celebrants were actually waiting for the host to expire. The $50 million exit from Griffin Systems was finally a reality. After 30 years of debugging and the relentless architecture of digital empires, I had signed the last paper. The Chicago sunset poured through the windows, bathing our table in a warm, deceptive amber glow. I ran a thumb over the leather strap of my watch, feeling the ghost of Maria's hand. "I wish you were here to see the river tonight, Maria," I whispered in the quiet hall of my thoughts. 30 years for one signature. The weight of the triumph was enough to make my lungs feel thin. It should have been a night of absolute victory. But in my line of work, the most dangerous errors are the ones that look like success. My son arrived exactly at 7, flanked by his wife, appearing like the definition of the American dream. Easton Griffin, my 38-year-old son, adjusted his Italian silk tie with a hand that lacked my steady resolve, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. Beside him was Megan Griffin, 34, a pharmaceutical consultant, with a notebook constantly open and a gaze that appraised everything for its market value. They moved with a practiced predatory grace, offering congratulations that felt as thin as a single line of unoptimized code. "We are so proud of you," Dad Easton said, his voice smooth but hollow. 50 million. It is life-changing. Megan leaned in her perfume, a sharp, clinical floral. "To the next chapter, Lance. You have earned the rest." I watched them, my analytical mind mapping the subtle, nervous energy in Easton's hands. It was a glitch in an otherwise perfect interface. In software, a single bug in the kernel can crash the entire system. I was looking at my son, and for the first time, I saw the syntax error in his smile. He was too eager for the second round of drinks, too focused on the waiter's movements. I sat at the head of the table, the patriarch of a dying dynasty, feeling the vibration of the jazz bass through the floorboards. The golden glow of the Chicago sunset was fading, now replaced by the artificial, cold blue lights of the skyline. We talked about the future, about the Astor Foundation I planned to build in Maria's name, and about the legacy of Griffin Systems. They listened with the kind of forced patience a predator shows its prey. Easton led Megan to the dance floor as the jazz trio started a slow melody. I was alone for a moment, the cold sweat on the wine glass chilling my palm. That was when I felt a presence at my shoulder. Aaron Platt, a 42-year-old floor captain, with a gaze that missed nothing between the tables, leaned down to whisper a sentence that would change my world. He didn't bring the menu. He didn't ask about dessert. "Mr. Griffin, do not touch that glass again," he murmured, his voice a low vibration beneath the saxophone. I froze. The world didn't tilt. It simply stopped. The jazz music became white noise, a distorted screech in my ears. I saw the young man drop something into your wine while the band started. Aaron continued, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if he were merely discussing the weather. My heart hammered against my ribs, a jagged rhythm. I looked at the deep red liquid in my glass, the same color as the blood in my veins, and realized my son wasn't waiting for a toast. He was waiting for a funeral. I didn't blink. In my world, when a system is compromised, you don't scream. You isolate the threat and secure the data. I stared at the deep red liquid in my glass, the same color as the blood in my veins, and realized my son wasn't waiting for a toast, he was waiting for a funeral. The ice in my chest was a physical weight, cold and jagged. I could see the reflection of the lanterns dancing in the wine, mocking the supposed celebration of my life's work. I've spent 40 years building firewalls against hackers and corporate espionage, but I never thought to build one against my own blood. As Easton and Megan glided back from the dance floor, their faces flushed with the hollow joy of the hunt, I adjusted my internal architecture. I reached into the pocket of my suit jacket, my fingers brushing against the small, empty plastic pill bottle I carry for my cardiac medication. The architect in me is always prepared for a system failure, though I never imagined the failure would be a moral one. "Beautiful song, isn't it, Easton?" I said, my voice coming out as smooth as a polished line of code. I swirled the Cabernet, pretending to admire the bouquet, watching the oily legs of the wine slide down the glass. "I'm just savoring the finish. This vintage is complex." I caught a glimpse of Easton's eyes. There was a hunger there, a predatory flicker that I had mistaken for ambition for 38 years. While Aaron Platt moved to a neighboring table to refill water glasses, creating the necessary line-of-sight obstruction, I leaned toward the large potted fern beside our table. With a quick, practiced motion that felt like deleting a corrupted file, I dumped the majority of the liquid into the damp soil. Have you ever felt the air turn to lead in your lungs? That's what happens when you realize the person who shares your DNA is counting your heartbeats. My heart gave a singular traitorous twitch against my ribs. Under the cover of the heavy white tablecloth, I unscrewed the cap of the pill bottle. My hands were steady, a byproduct of a lifetime spent in high-pressure environments, but my soul was screaming. I poured a small, concentrated amount of the remaining wine into the bottle and secured the cap. The click of the plastic felt like the locking of a vault. I tucked the forensic evidence back into my pocket, feeling its warmth through the expensive silk lining. I could feel the cold sweat on my original glass, a testament to the biological reality I was currently fighting. To the outside world, I was just a man enjoying a $50 million sunset. The restaurant was a stage, the jazz was the soundtrack, and I was a man playing the role of a victim while carrying the evidence of my own attempted murder in my pocket. I looked at Megan. She was watching me with an inquisitive gaze, her pharmaceutical mind, perhaps calculating the onset time of whatever cocktail they'd prepared. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor with a harsh, discordant sound. "I need air," I announced, cutting through Easton's feigned concern. I think the excitement of the deal is finally catching up with me. Indigestion, perhaps. "Dad, is everything okay?" Easton asked, stepping toward me. I didn't let him touch me. "Stay. Finish the bottle." I said the words, tasting like copper. I have a forgotten server emergency at the office. I dropped a stack of $100 bills on the table, enough to cover the bill, and the silence I hoped I'd bought from Aaron. I nodded once to the floor captain, as I passed him a silent acknowledgement of the life he had just handed back to me. I caught Easton's reflection in a large, gilt-edged mirror near the exit. He wasn't looking at my back with the worry of a son. He was staring at my empty wine glass with a predatory calculation that made my skin crawl. I hit the cool, humid night air of Wacker Drive, the pill bottle burning a hole in my suit jacket. Behind me, the string lights of the terrace looked like a row of hangman's nooses dangling over the river. The leather interior of my car usually smelled like success and expensive cedar, but tonight it felt like a sealed coffin on wheels. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine idling with a low, predatory hum that vibrated through my spine. Outside, the night air of Wacker Drive was thick with the humidity of a dying summer, and the string lights of the restaurant receded in my rearview mirror like a row of hangman's nooses. I pulled into traffic, my movements mechanical and precise, the way I used to write code before the world became about signatures and boardrooms. I was being hunted by my own DNA. My eyes darted to the mirrors every 3 seconds, scanning for the silver sedan Easton favored, or any headlight that lingered too long in my wake. I reached for the console, deactivating the GPS and killing the phone's location, sharing with a series of sharp taps. It was a bitter irony. Every digital convenience I had personally helped design for the city's elite was now a tracking beacon for the man I used to carry on my shoulders. I realized then that the safety features I helped integrate into Riverside Towers were exactly what Easton would try to exploit. He knew my logic. He knew my back doors. I was the architect, but he was the apprentice who had spent a lifetime studying the blueprints of my mind. "Focus, Lance," I whispered to the empty cabin. Code red. "Isolate the intruder." I forced my breathing to slow, treating the panic as a rogue process that needed to be terminated. The streets of Chicago blurred past a kaleidoscope of cold neon and dark shadows as I navigated a path that was as much about evasion as it was about reaching home. The drive felt like a descent into a darker reality, where the fundamental laws of family had been overwritten by a malicious script. Do you know what it sounds like when 30 years of trust snaps? It is not a bang. It is the hollow sound of a biometric lock clicking into place against your own child. I reached Riverside Towers and pulled into the secure garage, my hands tight on the wheel. I didn't take the elevator to my floor immediately. Instead, I stopped at the desk. Mr. Anderson, the night shift concierge, whose voice was as polished as the lobby's marble, answered on the first ring when I called from the internal line. My voice was a cold, clinical rasp of authority as I gave the order. "Easton Griffin is no longer authorized," I told him. "Not the lobby, not the gym, and especially not my floor. Revoke the permanent access key and the facial recognition profile immediately." Mr. Anderson didn't ask questions. He was paid for his discretion. "Yes, Mr. Griffin," he replied. "I will update the biometric database at once." The sterile hum of the elevator as I ascended to the 18th floor felt like a countdown. My hands finally started to shake, not out of fear, but from the sheer energy it took to keep my world from splintering into a million jagged pieces. Inside Unit 18B, I didn't turn on the lights. I moved through the kitchen like a ghost, clearing the pantry with a methodical, ruthless efficiency. I dumped every open bottle of water and swept my prescription medications into a trash bag. Bleach. I needed the smell of bleach to drown out the scent of betrayal. While I scrubbed the counter, I found a glossy, slightly bent photo tucked near the toaster. It was 1994. Easton was 8, learning to ride a bike, looking at me with a face full of pure, unadulterated love. When did the binary flip? When did you become a virus? I stared at the boy in the photo, a memory of a son who no longer existed, now replaced by a man who wanted me in the ground. I realized the wine sample in my pocket was a timer. If I didn't get it tested within 24 hours, the proof might degrade. The screen of my phone lit up, casting a cold blue glow over the photo. One new message from Easton: Dad, where'd you go? We're worried. Don't do something you'll regret. I didn't wait for the sun to clear the Chicago skyline before I began the process of erasing my son's existence from my life. The night had been a grueling marathon of silence, punctuated only by the cold blue glow of my smartphone sitting on the bedside table. I sat by the window of Unit 18B watching the first light of dawn struggle against the heavy shadows of the Willis Tower, my mind racing through lines of defensive logic. The message on my screen from Easton was still there, a digital parasite feeding on my exhaustion. Dad, where'd you go? We're worried. Don't do something you'll regret. I realized then that the text wasn't an expression of concern. It was a ping, a tactical query, sent to see if the drug had already induced the intended disorientation. He wasn't checking on my heart. He was checking on his investment, waiting for the system to crash so he could reboot it in his favor. At 7:30 a.m. sharp, I picked up the phone. My voice was a clinical rasp as I called Patricia Coleman. Patricia, the system is compromised, I told her without preamble. I need a clean environment by noon. There was a pause on the other end, long enough for me to hear the faint hum of her own early morning activity. Lance, she replied, her tone shifting from professional to wary. You sound like you've seen a ghost. Or a crime. Maybe both, I said, the weight of the pill bottle in my pocket feeling heavier with every passing second. I'll be there in 30 minutes. I showered and dressed in a dark suit that felt more like armor than silk. By the time I reached the 12th floor of the LaSalle Street building, the city was awake, but I felt like I was moving through a simulation. Patricia Coleman, 52, a high-stakes attorney whose office overlooked the river with the same gray coldness as her legal briefs, leaned across the mahogany desk as I entered. She didn't offer coffee. She saw the plastic pill bottle in my hand and the way I held my jaw rigid. I laid the wine sample on her desk, the cold condensation forming a ring on the polished wood that smelled of expensive mahogany and old paper. I told her everything, the warning from Aaron, the glint in Easton's eyes, the text. For a brief moment, my voice cracked when I had to say the word son, the biological weight of it nearly overriding my logic. He's still my son, Patricia. I taught him to ride a bike on these very streets. Patricia didn't blink. She cut through the emotion with surgical precision. Lance, look at the river, she said, gesturing to the gray, choppy water of the Chicago River below. It doesn't care about the history of the water, only the current. Start with facts you can prove, not feel. In software, when the core is corrupted, you don't patch the code because the error lies in the structure. You build a new environment and migrate the assets. That was the language I needed. I watched her gold pen move across the yellow legal pad, drafting the firebreaks of my new reality. We began the audit, revoking power of attorney, changing every beneficiary, and initiating the Astor Foundation. It felt like drawing a new blueprint for a building that was already on fire. Am I destroying him or saving myself? I asked, the words hollow in the sterile office air. You're drawing boundaries. Lance, Patricia replied, her pen never stopping its rhythmic tapping. That's not a weapon. It's architecture. How do you tell a woman who has known your family for 20 years that your legacy is currently trying to accelerate your probate. You don't. You just show her the data and let the law do the work. But as Patricia scanned the final document in my primary file, her rhythmic tapping stopped. She leaned forward, her eyes scanning a paragraph I hadn't noticed in years. "Lancy, there's a trusted party designation on your primary account from a year ago," she said, her voice dropping as she turned the monitor toward me. "Easton is already inside the vault." I clutched the pill bottle in my pocket, like a live grenade as I stepped into the sterile white silence of Riverside Private Diagnostics. The transition from Patricia's wood-paneled office to this clinical sanctuary was jarring, a shift from the theoretical world of legal briefs to the physical reality of toxins and blood chemistry. I didn't wait for the revolving doors to stop spinning before I headed straight for the intake desk. The lobby smelled of hospital-grade antiseptic and ozone, a scent that usually promised recovery, but today only reinforced my sense of peril. I watched the other patients, wealthy individuals in tailored coats, buying a few more years of high-priced life, and felt like an alien carrying a piece of a murder plot in my tailored wool. "I have a priority intake," I said to the receptionist, my voice steady, despite the hammer of my pulse against my ribs. "Code Coleman Delta." She didn't look up, her fingers tapping a rhythm on her keyboard that sounded like rain on a tin roof. "Room 4, Mr. Griffin. Dr. Stone is waiting." I walked down the hallway, the bright, flickering fluorescent lights overhead, casting long, jagged shadows on the linoleum. I realized then that the lab wasn't just checking for a simple poison. They were looking for interaction markers, substances that are harmless on their own, but lethal when combined with my specific heart medication. It was a sophisticated attack on the very system keeping me alive. Have you ever handed over a piece of your own potential death to a stranger in a lab coat? It's a strange kind of surrender. Dr. Jennifer Stone, a woman in her late 40s with a surgical precision in her movements and eyes that saw through flesh to the chemistry beneath, met me in the windowless intake room. The snap of her latex gloves echoed in the small space like a gunshot. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You have the sample, Lance." I pulled the plastic bottle from my pocket and placed it on the cold metal tray. The crinkle of the paper on the exam table beneath me sounded incredibly loud in the silence. I watched her every move, insisting on witnessing the sealing and labeling. I wasn't just a patient. I was a witness to my own betrayal. Every form I signed felt like another nail in the coffin of the life I had known only 24 hours ago. "Mr. Griffin, we follow a legal chain of custody here," Dr. Stone said as she carefully applied the tamper-evident seal. "Once I seal this, it doesn't exist to the world until the report is generated. I need a full toxicology screen," I insisted. "Everything from heavy metals to prescription sedatives." The lab was like a clean room for microchips. No dust, no emotion, just raw data waiting to be decoded by a machine that didn't care about my family history. Dr. Stone looked at the dark red liquid and then at me with a professional curiosity that bordered on pity. She noted the urgency on the intake form, her gold pen scratching across the surface. "If there is something in here, Lance, it was put there with intent. This isn't a kitchen accident." "I know," I replied, my gaze level with hers. "That's why I'm still standing." She mentioned that for an architect, I seemed to be building a very dark case against someone. She promised preliminary results by 3, warning that some substances leave very specific architectural footprints in a biological system. As she turned to leave, she paused at the door, her gloved hand holding my future. "By the way," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "another Griffin called earlier inquiring about family health screenings. They were asking for you by name. I felt a cold spike of ice go down my spine. The hunt was already moving into the medical sphere. We'll have the first markers by 3. But Mr. Griffin, be careful. People who use chemistry usually don't stop at 1 dose. I didn't enter my home like a resident. I entered it like a forensic investigator approaching a crime scene that hadn't been cordoned off yet. The heavy brass and marble atmosphere of the bank was still fresh in my mind. But I knew the real battlefield wasn't a vault. It was right here, among the smart lights and interconnected appliances I once called conveniences. I stood in the hallway of Unit 18B listening to the silence of a high-rise condo that suddenly felt like a tomb. Doctor, Stone's warning echoed in my ears. People who use chemistry don't stop at 1 dose. I headed straight for my study, my movements stiff, fueled by a cold, professional fury. I sat before my main console and bypassed the standard user interface, diving straight into the kernel logs of my home network. In software architecture, we call this a man-in-the-middle attack. In families, we just call it the ultimate betrayal. I used my knowledge of the system to hunt for unauthorized pings, searching for data packets that had no business being sent from my private life. That was when I found it. The Smart Medicine Cabinet, a thoughtful health tracking gift from Easton 3 months ago, was a Trojan horse. It was pulsing with activity, quietly transmitting my dosage logs and vital signs to an external IP. You used my own code against me, Easton. Amateur mistake. Let's see where the data leak actually begins. The rhythmic blue flicker of the server rack reflected off my glasses as I traced the route. The external IP didn't lead to a generic medical cloud. It belonged to a pharmaceutical research server Megan frequently uses for her high-end consulting work. The coffee in my hand turned to lead. My own house had been testifying against me for weeks, sending real-time telemetry of my biological functions to the person holding the syringe. Megan wasn't just guessing my cardiac needs. She was monitoring my medication schedule in real time to time the interaction markers perfectly. You weren't just watching me, Megan. You were measuring the exact window for my heart to stop. This was no longer just a son's clumsy greed. It was a daughter-in-law's clinical execution. I felt a cold sweat on the back of my neck as I realized the level of sophistication involved. I stood up the chair, scraping harshly against the floor, and moved to the kitchen. The air smelled of ozone and stale coffee, a scent I now associated with a breached perimeter. I opened the cabinet and reached for the backup bottles of my heart medication. Using a high-powered magnification tool I usually reserved for inspecting hardware boards, I leaned over the kitchen island. There, under the harsh light, I saw the microscopic, glinting scratches on the safety seals. They had been tampered with or replaced entirely. Not just 1 dose. Dr. Stone was right. They didn't want a quick death that would trigger a forensic red flag. They wanted a natural failure, a slow-motion heart attack that would look like the inevitable decline of a 68-year-old man under too much stress. I retreated back to the study, my fingers flying across the keys as I initiated a full, deep scan of the home server. I wasn't just patching a leak anymore. I was building a bunker. My pulse was a steady, dangerous rhythm. Now the architect was back in control. That was when I found a hidden folder buried 3 layers deep in a partitioned drive masked as a system update. The title was probate_timeline_final. I opened the properties. The file was created using Megan's credentials 2 weeks before the company sale even finalized. I stared at the microscopic scratches on my pill bottle again, then back at the monitor. It wasn't just a poisoning. It was an execution schedule mapped out with the precision of a software roadmap. And according to the file Megan left behind, the final stage of the process was set. I was supposed to be gone by Friday. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned the same porcelain white as the bank's marble facade. If Megan's schedule was correct, I had exactly 72 hours to become a ghost in the financial system. The discovery of the probate timeline back at the condo had been a system-wide shock, a realization that my own home was a compromised environment. I needed to move fast. I left the car with the valet and stepped through the heavy, imposing doors of First National Bank, feeling the cold air conditioning hit me like a splash of glacial water. I bypassed the standard teller lines, heading directly for the private wealth management wing, where the air smelled of expensive floor wax and old quiet money. Mrs. Roberts, a woman whose pearls were as hard as her financial logic, had managed my millions with a quiet efficiency for 2 decades. She greeted me with a professional smile, but I could see her appraising my weary eyes. We entered her office, and the heavy click of the vault-style door behind us sounded like a final seal. "I need a full sweep, Eleanor," I said, sitting down before her mahogany desk. "Every account, every authorization. I want to know exactly who has the keys to my kingdom." She nodded, her fingers dancing across a keyboard. "Of course, Lance. You've always been meticulous about the architecture of your holdings." I watched the bright white glare of her computer monitor my mind, scanning for vulnerabilities. That was when the first major breach appeared. Eleanor paused, her brow furrowing. "It seems a trusted party designation was added to your primary accounts exactly 1 year ago," she murmured. "It was buried under the routine merger paperwork for Griffin Systems." I felt a cold spike of adrenaline. He designated himself as the fail-safe. "I don't remember signing this." Eleanor scrolled through the digital files. It was in the corporate umbrella renewal packet. Lance. Page 78. Attached to it was a forged medical waiver, a subtle line of text suggesting I was already showing signs of early-onset cognitive decline a year ago. The execution schedule had a legal foundation I had signed off on without ever seeing. In a server farm, a trusted party is a backdoor. If you don't audit your permissions eventually, the guest takes over the root directory. My son had been building a parallel OS inside my life for 12 months. Waiting for the right moment to hit the enter key. The architecture of his betrayal was more sophisticated than I had ever given him credit for. My son didn't just want my money. He wanted my signature on my own death warrant. The realization made the wood-paneled office feel like a shrinking cage. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to an authoritative rasp. "Freeze it all, Eleanor. Now. Revoke every authorization. Transfer the liquid assets into a new partition trust under my sole biometric signature." Eleanor looked at me, her hand hovering over the mouse. "Mr. Griffin, the moment I hit send on this revocation, your son will receive an automated alert. It's part of the security protocol." I didn't hesitate. "Do it. I'd rather he see me coming than watch me die in my sleep." As she worked, the silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the hum of the office HVAC. By freezing these accounts, I was inadvertently triggering a secondary effect, a power reversal. I knew Easton had leveraged his status to secure private loans. The moment this freeze hit, his creditors would be notified that his contingent assets were no longer available. I wasn't just protecting myself. I was pulling the rug out from under his entire deck of cards. Ms. Roberts hit the final key with a sharp, decisive tap. The system processed the request, the progress bar on her screen reaching 100%. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of declared war. "It's done, Lance." she said, her eyes meeting mine with a flicker of genuine concern. But your phone is going to start ringing in exactly 3 seconds. I watched my smartphone spin on the mahogany desk, its vibration a digital growl that shattered the silence Eleanor had just created. It was the first volley of a war I had once hoped was a misunderstanding. The caller ID glowed with a name that used to bring me pride, Easton. I stared at it until the screen went dark, only for the red notification dot to blink a second later, signaling a voicemail. Eleanor Roberts looked at me with a pained expression, her hand still resting near the keyboard that had just dismantled my son's financial leverage. "Let it ring, Eleanor," I said, my voice sounding like dry parchment. "Silence is the only leverage I have left." She nodded slowly, her professional mask finally showing a crack of human empathy. "Be careful, Lance. The system works, but it isn't a shield." I gathered my coat and left the bank, my senses heightened to a degree that bordered on clinical paranoia. Every footstep on the marble floor seemed to echo with the metallic taste of adrenaline. I realized that by freezing the accounts, I had tipped my hand. The text Easton had sent earlier, "Don't do something you'll regret," finally translated in my mind. It wasn't a warning about my financial decisions. It was a coded threat meant to sound like filial concern to any outsider, while reminding me that he held the key to the very chemistry of my survival. The element of surprise was gone, replaced by a brutal race against time. I made it to the parking garage and climbed into the sterile sanctuary of my car. The interior smelled like the expensive cedar and cold, stale coffee I couldn't bring himself to drink. I didn't pull out immediately. I sat there watching the bank exit through the rearview mirror, checking for shadows or familiar silver sedans. Hunger is a biological signal I usually respect, but today my stomach feels like a corrupted sector incapable of processing any input. I tried to eat a turkey sandwich I'd picked up earlier, but the bread felt like dry sponge and the meat tasted like ash. My thoughts drifted to my heart, the biological pump that Griffin Systems had been built to support. It was a weakness I had shared only with family, a set of vulnerabilities now exposed in Megan's execution schedule. I was a software architect who had forgotten to secure his own biological kernel. I spent the next 2 hours in that dim concrete cave, watching the rhythmic flash of a turn signal from a nearby car, feeling the vibration of the steering wheel as other residents came and went. I was waiting for the data to compile. At 3 p.m. sharp, the phone screamed again. I didn't hesitate. Dr. Jennifer Stone's voice was as sharp and sterile as a scalpel when she answered. "Mr. Griffin, we found the cocktail," she said, bypassing any greeting. "High concentrations of benzodiazepine and clear traces of warfarin." I felt the air leave my lungs. She continued with a chilling, professional detachment. "With your heart condition, Lance, this wasn't an attempt to make you sleep. The benzodiazepine was for the haze to keep you confused while the warfarin did the work. It was a plan to stop your heart while you dreamt." Benzodiazepine. Warfarin. The words sounded like a funeral march played on a synthesizer. But there was more. Stone paused, her tone shifting slightly. "The warfarin dosage was specifically calibrated to match a generic version you stopped taking 3 years ago. It wasn't in your digital cloud, Lance. This proves the attacker had access to your old physical medical files." The realization hit me harder than the toxicology report. Someone had been digging through the boxes in my basement, long before the sale was even a whisper in a boardroom. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles cracked the leather, groaning under the pressure. "Thank you, Dr. Stone. Send the full report to Patricia immediately." I ended the call and stared at my own reflection in the rearview mirror. I wasn't just a father anymore. I was the architect of my own survival, and the foundation was already crumbling beneath my feet. $50 million is a heavy weight to move in the dark, but it's nothing compared to the weight of a dead wife's legacy. I walked back into Patricia's office, the air feeling even thinner and colder than it had only a few hours ago. I sat across from Patricia, watching the golden light of the late afternoon hit the expensive mahogany desk in long, slanted bars of amber. I had just finished the call with Dr. Stone, and the clinical proof of lethal intent was still ringing in my ears, like a high-frequency alarm. "Move it all, Patricia," I said, my voice a flat, steady rasp that felt like dry parchment. "I want the accounts emptied before the sun sets." I watched her execute the final series of wire transfers, the rhythmic tapping of her keyboard, the only sound in the wood-paneled room. Each click of her mouse felt like a structural reinforcement, a digital wall rising between my life's work and the son who wanted to inherit it prematurely. "We're creating a blind trust, Lance," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the glowing monitor. "He can't see what he can't touch. Moving money is like rerouting traffic in a high-load network. You don't just stop the flow. You create a decoy path so the system doesn't crash from the sudden change in internal pressure." While the wires processed, I pulled a stack of heavy bond paper toward me and began drafting the foundational documents for the Astor Foundation. The name felt like a prayer whispered into the wind. I explained to Patricia that the choice was for Maria. She always said Astors were about endurance. I said the feel of a fountain pen in my hand, grounding me. They were the ones she said forgave a season by blooming at its very end. I realized this foundation wasn't just a tax shelter or a defensive strategy. It was the only way to ensure my money did the good that Easton never would. I signed the papers with a grim sense of satisfaction. My pulse was steady now, the analytical architect fully back online. This foundation's charter specifically excludes any biological heirs from ever holding a board seat. I added, watching the dark ink sink into the grain of the paper. It was a permanent legal firebreak. Coffee tastes like ash when you are signing away your son's inheritance to save your own life. But I didn't hesitate for a single second. I was building a new legacy, one that Easton's greed could never touch or corrupt. The silence of the office was suddenly shattered by the sharp, persistent ring of Patricia's desk phone. It was Ms. Roberts from First National Bank, her voice tight with an urgency that ignored all professional decorum. "He's at the branch in Naperville, Lance," she said over the speakerphone, her voice crackling with tension. "He's causing a scene, trying to override the wire freeze. He's claiming you aren't thinking clearly, and that you're in the middle of a major medical episode." The adrenaline hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The hunt had officially moved from the digital shadows to the physical world. "Tell them to call the police if he doesn't leave immediately," I commanded. The architect is officially out of the office, but Eleanor wasn't finished. "He didn't come to the bank alone, Lance. He brought a man who identified himself as a private care manager." The legal gaslighting was no longer a theory. It was a deployment of a hostile script. I looked at Patricia, the phone still warm in my hand, and the smell of stale office coffee suddenly cloying and heavy. "He's at the bank. He brought someone with him. It's starting." I could feel the cold sweat on the back of my neck, the same one I'd felt in the restaurant. Patricia didn't blink. She just closed the file on her desk with a definitive snap. "Then it's time to find you a place where he can't find the front door. We're going off the grid, Lance. Right now." I watched the paper shredder in the corner of Patricia's office, its rhythmic growl a warning in the world of high-stakes estate planning. If you don't destroy the old paper trail, it eventually becomes your shroud. The sunset over Wacker Drive had been a bleeding streak of crimson, But inside these wood-paneled walls, the atmosphere was as cold and dry as a tomb. I sat across from Patricia, my hands resting on a heavy silver paperweight that felt like an anchor in a storm. We were no longer just building a foundation. We were performing a deep forensic audit of my entire existence. "We need to purge every line, Patricia," I said, my voice cutting through the smell of ozone from the shredder. "If my name is on it, Easton's needs to be gone." "It's a lot of ink to dry, Lance," she replied, her face shadowed by the dimming afternoon light through the office blinds. "We're rewriting 15 years of expectations in 4 hours." As her junior associate brought in a thick folder containing decades of easy trust, the entry twist hit me like a physical blow. Hidden within a corporate umbrella renewal packet I'd signed 2 years ago was a $5 million life insurance policy with a double indemnity clause. A cardiac episode caused by drug interaction would likely trigger that clause, turning my death into a massive windfall. I realized then that the plan wasn't just opportunistic, it was architectural. Have you ever found a price tag on your own life hidden inside a legal document you signed with a smile? It's a very specific kind of nausea. I sat through the grueling review of retirement accounts and brokerage PODs, realizing that almost everything I owned still pointed to Easton. These were the remnants of a father's once unshakable faith, now rendered as vulnerabilities in a compromised system. The paper felt like sandpaper against my fingertips. Every signature was a stitch in a shroud I had been unknowingly sewing for myself. We reached page 78 of the renewal packet, the cloak that had hidden the most lethal part of the betrayal. "I don't remember this," I whispered, staring at the mundane insurance riders. I was focused on the tech exit. Patricia leaned forward, her eyes hard. "That's exactly why he put it there, Lance. He's been waiting for 2 years for your heart to stop." The shock of the premeditation made my pulse pound against my wrist, a rhythmic scratching that matched the sound of my fountain pen as I began to strip him from every policy. I replaced him with the Astor Foundation, each stroke of the nib a tactical strike against the son who had priced my life at $5 million. My own hands were steady, but my mind was a chaotic storm of memories being systematically deleted. Have you ever wondered how many years of love it takes to offset a single afternoon of cold-blooded greed? I didn't have the answer, only the mounting evidence of a long-term hunt. The rhythmic growl of the shredder continued as I fed the old authorizations into its teeth, watching my past become gray confetti. I dropped the pen. The ink was still wet, but the man I called my son was already dead to me. There was a grim finality to the silence that followed, a death of hope that no legal document could ever fully repair. I was operating in pure survival architecture mode, now numb to the pain but hypersensitive to the danger. Patricia looked at the signature on page 79, the secondary witness line that I had previously ignored, and turned the folder toward me with a slow, deliberate motion. "Look at the witness line on the insurance policy, Lance," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency. "It isn't Easton's signature. It belongs to the care manager from the bank. The conspirators have been a team for a long time." I stared at the name, the cold weight of the silver paperweight finally matching the ice in my veins. The trap wasn't just a family affair. It was a professional execution. A high-rise condo in Chicago is supposed to be a fortress of glass and steel, but tonight, my home felt like a glass trap where the predator had a copy of the blueprints. I drove away from Patricia's office as the city lights began to blur into streaks of artificial neon. Every shadow in my rearview mirror looked like a tail, every headlight a threat. I needed a sanctuary, but not one linked to my name. I chose the Riverside Inn, a mid-range hotel, where the carpeting smelled of industrial cleaner, and the air was recycled through vents that had seen better decades. It was the kind of place a man of my standing wouldn't be caught dead, in which was exactly the point. I checked in under the name Arthur Miller, my grandfather's name, hoping the thin layer of pseudonymity would hold. Room 412. Quiet side of the building, please. I told the clerk, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. I'm just a man looking for a night of uninterrupted sleep. But as I handed over my credit card for the deposit, a chill settled in my marrow. I was a refugee in my own city, hunted by the very person I had built my legacy for, and I was leaving a digital breadcrumb with every transaction. I retreated to the room, the low hum of the mini-fridge providing a lonely soundtrack to my paranoia. I sat on the edge of the polyester bedspread and opened my tablet connecting to the encrypted Riverside Towers security feed. The screen flared to life with the bluish tint of the night vision cameras. I watched the lobby and my own hallway, with the intensity of a hawk, my pulse drumming a frantic rhythm in my ears. A vibration in my hand signaled a text from Patricia. She had confirmed the identity of the witness on that hidden $5 million insurance policy. It was the care manager Easton had brought to the bank. The circle was closing. They were working together, a medical trap, a legal gaslighting campaign, and a financial execution, all synchronized with terrifying precision. Have you ever watched your own front door through a digital lens and felt like a trespasser in your own life? It is a unique form of violation. At 1:30 a.m., the hallway camera triggered. I felt the sharp spike of adrenaline before I even saw his face. Easton appeared, his features distorted by the wide-angle lens accompanied by a man carrying a heavy professional locksmith's bag. I realized then that the locksmith wasn't just there to open a door. Easton was trying to plant evidence of my incompetence, perhaps staged medication or forged notes, inside the condo before the guardianship hearing could even be contested. Click. The locksmith's tool met the steel plate. It sounded like a bone snapping through the tablet's speakers. I didn't hesitate. I called the building's security desk, my voice a low, dangerous rasp. Anderson, look at the monitor for 18B. My son is trying to breach the unit with a locksmith. Stop them. Now. I watched the screen as two uniformed guards rounded the corner. Tell him if he stays one more minute, the Chicago PD will be there for the arrest, I barked into the phone. The confrontation was brief, but jagged. Easton's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage as he was forced back toward the elevator. But just before the doors closed, he turned and looked directly into the doorbell camera. He didn't shout. He didn't struggle. He simply mouthed 4 words. I know where you used your card, Dad. A cold spike of ice went through my chest. My pseudonym had been a paper shield against a credit card transaction alert. I stared at the screen as he vanished. He didn't look defeated. He looked like he was just changing the coordinates of the hunt. My phone pinged a transaction alert from the Riverside Inn. He hadn't found me through luck. He had followed the money, and now he was coming for the source. I didn't wait for the elevator. I began packing my bag in the dark of room 412, my movements mechanical and efficient. The digital notification on my phone earlier had been a beacon for the predator, a trail of breadcrumbs I had inadvertently dropped in the middle of a dark forest. I didn't reach for the light when the knock finally came sharp and insistent. In the oppressive silence of the hotel room, the sound was as heavy as a hammer hitting a coffin nail, vibrating through the thin carpet and into my bones. I stood perfectly still, watching the distorted image on the door's fisheye lens. Easton was alone, looking disheveled. His tie loosened as if the frantic pressure of the hunt were finally fraying his own nerves. Dad, open up. Please, we just need to talk. His voice came through the heavy, solid wood, muffled but saturated with a manufactured desperation. I leaned my forehead against the cool surface of the door, but I didn't reach for the deadbolt. Say it where the cameras hear you, Easton. I said, my voice a low, lethal rasp. I was holding my tablet, the recording software already capturing every decibel. Through the wood, he begged for an off-the-record talk, claiming he was just worried about my health. It was Warfarin Easton. That's a very specific mistake for a man who says he just wanted me to sleep. There was a sharp, jagged silence on the other side. I realized then that his disheveled look was partially staged. He wasn't there to apologize. He was checking the response time of my brain, looking for the cognitive confusion the drug was supposed to induce. He was testing his malware on a biological host. Have you ever looked at your own child through a fisheye lens and seen a stranger? It distorts more than just the face. It reveals the predatory curvature of a soul you once thought you knew. Eventually, I saw the shadow of Megan arrive in the hall, her hand on his shoulder pulling a broken Easton back toward the stairwell. I didn't breathe until the hallway was empty, and the blue-tinted feed showed them gone. I sat on the edge of the bed and began the digital blackout. No more card trails. I am going ghost. I called Patricia to announce the change. The architecture has to change, Patricia. They found me through the bank alert. I'm switching to cash only from here on out. I discarded my phone, the screen flickering once before I plunged it into a glass of lukewarm water. I spent the remaining hours in a state of hypervigilance, the room feeling like a concrete bunker. As dawn broke over the Chicago River, casting a gray, filtered light through the dusty blinds, I reached for the sealed envelope I had retrieved from the condo's hidden safe. It was the letter Maria wrote before her final surgery. The sound of paper tearing with surgical precision was the only noise in the room. Her words provided the ultimate validation, a message from the past that felt like a critical patch for a corrupted heart. Lance, protect yourself, even from our son, she had written in her elegant script. She saw the rot in him years ago, a memory of a boy replaced by a calculation. The tears didn't feel like weakness. They felt like a system purge, clearing out the last of the denial that had kept my fire brakes from closing properly. I wept for the woman who saw the truth, and for the man I had to become to honor her memory. I taught you to ride a bike, Easton. Now I will teach you about walls. Maria's letter revealed one final secret. She had set up a secondary hidden security trigger in the family's estate that only I could activate. It was her final gift, a kill switch for the inheritance Easton so desperately craved. I wiped my eyes and strapped on Maria's leather-banded watch, the cold weight of the metal watch buckle a reminder of the time I had left. The sun was up, the shadows were gone, and I finally knew exactly how many fire breaks I had to build before sunset. I sat in a booth that smelled of grease and cheap floor wax, watching Patricia slide a manila folder across the table like a dealer passing a losing hand. In the shadows of this diner, $50 million felt like a fever dream, but the threat in that folder was cold and very real. I had spent the dawn hours discarding my digital self, moving through the streets of Chicago like a ghost. But the physical reality of the betrayal was catching up to me. The yellowed, sticky texture of the diner menu under my palm served as a grounding wire. I didn't hire you to find a tragic backstory, Patricia, I said, my voice barely a whisper over the distant rumble of a passing truck. I hired you for armor. She wasn't always a Griffin Lance. She was a Carter, and the Carters lost everything. Patricia replied, her eyes fixed on the grainy black and white photocopy of an old newspaper clipping she had pulled from the file. I leaned in my analytical mind, instantly mapping the data points. Megan's maiden name was Megan Carter. Her father, Thomas Carter, had owned a small logistics firm that was dismantled by a fraudulent acquisition when Megan was just 12 years old. The entry twist hit me with the force of an unhandled exception. The fraudulent firm that destroyed her family was a distant